I think the motives for art are very general, and they have much to do with commemoration. Like telling a story is a way of embodying some facts, some history. You want to tell the story of your ancestors. If you're an immigrant family, so you came to North America, let's say, 1850, there's a whole family story. So many writers want to write about that story, and they're commemorating their own ancestors and commemorating the generation. So I think that instinct is very strong. When I first read Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass, I was only about 8 or 9. They were the great gifts of my grandmother, really the great gifts of my whole childhood, as it seems in retrospect. I have my original copy at home, and it's all dog-eared. It's a nice book with illustrations, beautiful illustrations. And as soon as I open it, I've just memorized everything. I can remember all these passages, and I remember the little drawings on the top of the page and so forth. So it's one of the works of art that I've memorized because it's very deeply imprinted in my brain. Those classic children's books have really been deeply imprinted in my soul. And so I probably think of Alice in Wonderland every day of my life. And Lewis Carroll became a writer with whom I identified in different ways. He was very, very playful and very funny and subversive. And some of the humor is dark. It's a shockingly dark humor for children's books. And some of it's whimsical and childlike. So I like to think that I embody all those traits in my own writing that Lewis Carroll obviously had. There are many things we can take away from Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass, but one of the primary thoughts that I came away as a little girl, I think, is that a little girl, Alice is about 10, a little girl can have wild adventures in the world that are actually pretty nightmarish, and yet the little girl doesn't panic, she doesn't run away screaming, she doesn't burst into tears. She sometimes is concerned, and she may be a little worried, but she doesn't become hysterical. So it's an example of a children's book in which a child who happens to be a girl, and that was important, a little girl sees all sorts of adults behaving very badly. I mean, they're calling for one another's heads to be cut off. They're doing really awful things. But the little girl comes away from it with some degree of maturity, and it sends a signal of control, that a child can have some control over her environment, and she doesn't have to panic. So I think because Alice is maybe a typical upper middle class British girl of the 19th century, those qualities maybe are very attractive, that one doesn't become hysterical. One always keeps control, and Alice is always thinking to herself in a very logical and rational way. So I think I inherited some of that for my own personal life. Oprah magazine had a feature some years ago for women writers to interview their own mothers. And I thought it was maybe a little silly idea, but I interviewed my mother, and I was totally astounded. And that gave me the idea, not just for one novel, but for more than one. I mean, my mother had so many adventures and experiences we never knew, the children never knew. She never talked about herself. My grandmother, who was Jewish and repudiated Judaism, I never asked her any questions. I was too young, I didn't know. If I had asked her, she might have answered, but I'm so sorry that never happened. But my mother said, I'm so ashamed because my mother gave me away when I was 9 months old. And so my mother started crying, and I had never heard my mother talk that way. And I was stunned. She said, I was given away because we were too poor and they couldn't take care of me. So I was given away to an aunt and uncle. But there were 8 children in the family and she was given away. So she said, I cried about it every day. And I couldn't believe my mother. She never talked about that. So I wrote a novel. I wrote a couple of novels. One is called Missing Mom. It's basically about my mother. And there have been other experiences. The idea of being given away and being ashamed and crying. And she said how she used to go back to the old household and she would come down the road and they would say, go back home, you don't belong here. And she said, I cried all the time. She started crying. She was like 81 years old. So to me, that was fantastic. So if anyone has any experiences like that, interviewing a grandparent, it could change your life, really. I never knew my mother. I never knew my mother had that experience. So to me, that was an eye-opener. If you're writing about real people, of course, you might want to transmogrify it so it's not so obvious. I mean, obviously, people change names, they change descriptions, they change places. The idea of somebody giving a baby away is not that unusual in fairy tales, so one of the archetypes is a baby's found in the bulrushes, a baby's given away. Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights is an infant who just sort of shows up and nobody knows who the mother is or the father is. So my mother had an experience that was somewhat universal. So you can always write about a universal experience. But of course, I would not write about my actual mother. And if I tried to in a memoir, I would make sure that she read it or she, it was all right. Because as people get older, they care less about these things. The people she would have been embarrassed about were all dead. I mean, she was the last in her family. There were 9 children in her family and they all died. So by the time she talked about this, they were gone, So there are many things you can do. I think that one ought not to exploit other people and never hurt anybody. Never use your writing to hurt anybody. That's not a good motive. Some people use writing to settle scores. You do see that in Philip Roth sometime. He's writing about women he knew. But I don't think that's the best motive for writing. Throughout my life, I've been really captivated by mystery, and I've written a number of mystery suspense novels. I really think that at the heart of our experience as human beings, as adults, we have a memory of mysteries in childhood. And I think that the great mystery writers, like Raymond Chandler and Earl Stanley Gardner and Agatha Christie, I really think those people, Patricia Highsmith definitely, that something happened to them in their childhoods that they really were very, very in the grip of mystery and bewilderment. And so they keep writing mystery detective fiction and pursuing some narrative that comes to an ending, because the detective mystery form always has an ending. The last chapter always has an ending. It's a resolution that you don't always find in literature. And so when I think about my own life, I think there are many mysteries. And I had this idea at some point, maybe 20 years ago, an unsolved mystery is a thorn in the heart. That'll be the first line of a memoir, a story, or an essay. So I actually wrote something with that. It's a memory of something that happened to a girlfriend of mine, a classmate in high school. It didn't really happen to me, but it happened to her. She was the first person in my whole life who committed suicide. Now, we didn't really know at the time. It was kept secret that she had committed suicide, but she died. She was only 18. So why did she die? And her parents maybe covered it up. They didn't want to talk about it. So an unsolved mystery is a thorn in the heart. So it was like 40 years before I wrote it. I suggest to any emerging writer, whether young or old or whatever, that you think of some mystery in your life, and you certainly may have that first line, which I've given to writing students. An unsolved mystery is a thorn in the heart. And that is your first line of your story. An unsolved mystery is a thorn in the heart. And just think about it. You may think about it for several days or weeks or months, but something will come to you, and like, what's the second line? I would suggest that's the first paragraph, and then you have another paragraph. I wouldn't make it all one paragraph. I would have that just by itself, and then, like, when I was 10 years old, when I was in college, when my father moved out, when my mother got ill, that next paragraph is the thorn in your heart that you've never been able to deal with. Well, another assignment is to revisit a place that means a lot to you in your memory. Deep in our brains, really deep in the deepest part of our brains, are the memories very powerfully encoded of the first room you ever lived in, the first house you lived in, the first people you saw, maybe your young parents. They were young maybe when you were born, and then your grandparents. All those memories are deep in your brain. So if you can evoke them by a certain smell, for me it was the smell of lilac. It was a lilac bush right outside my window when I was a little girl. And the smell of a farm, of barns, a hay barn, the sight of chickens or cats or something in a farm, that evokes a whole lot of memory for me. So the assignment is to take a memory, the earliest memory you have, and to try to evoke it and write about it very powerfully. And if you write about it powerfully, when you finish it, you may have the beginning of a story.